Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Shternshis, and I'm Ala Malka Green, Professor of Yiddish Studies and Director on leave of Tanenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm super excited to introduce this event for us. This event has a special pleasure for me and significance because all the participants of it are presenting the cutting-edge scholarship in history of the Holocaust and narratives of violence, and also they are closely connected to University of Toronto. Two of them, Joanna Krongold and Sara-Jane Vigneault, were my students, and I am excited to hear them speak. And Anna Veprinska is our short postdoctoral fellow working with Professor Bergen. So we're in for a treat. So what's going to happen now is I will introduce each of our speakers before they speak. They will each speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. And after that, the audience will have a chance to ask them questions. If you have a question, please write it in the chat. And if I like your question, you will be called to ask it with your voice. I'm joking. We will let people ask the questions if they're there. So anyway, here are our speakers in the order of their appearance later today. So our first speaker is Dr. Joanna Krongold, who many of you know as your professor. If you're a grad student here, then she doesn't need extra introduction. Professor Krongold received her PhD from the University of Toronto's English department in 2020. Building upon her master's degree from the University of Oxford, where she studied literary presentations of trauma, Joanna's doctoral dissertation examined the use of metaphor and figurative dynamics in youth Holocaust literature. Her current project dwells on the relationship between genocide and ecocide by applying eco-critical lens to Holocaust literature. She's currently, as I said, the course instructor for our graduate seminar and also working at the Living and Learning in Retirement, continuing education organization located in Toronto. Also, Joanna, Doris Bergen, and I have taught numerous years together course on Holocaust and literature, and I'm super excited to say that, and I know Professor Bergen is probably here, to say that we learned so much from Joanna and her approach to history of youth literature and Holocaust literature, and I'm really excited to hear Joanna speak today. So after Joanna, you hear from Sara-Jane Vigneault, who recently graduated with an MA from the University of Toronto Centers for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and the collaborative program on Jewish Studies. Sara-Jane was supervised by Professor Doris Bergen, and her dissertation was called Filling and Bridging the Gaps, Two Daughters' Paths to Uncover Their Mother from Beyond Obliteration. This work was examined Irene Nemirovsky's novel, Soude Français, and her daughters working through the process of archival research and the use of fiction and post-memory literature. So right now, Sara-Jane is working in a lot of different capacities as a research officer, for example, at the European Center for Research and Documentation in Germany. And also she works with Professor Susan Solomon on her new documentary I can't read the title, on children of the Holocaust and Rwandan genocide. Again, super excited to hear from Sara-Jane. I have not heard about this new project yet, so just read the paper and I know you're in for a treat. And last but definitely not the least is Dr. Anna Befrinska, who is our current short postdoctoral fellow at the Department of History. She works under the supervision of Professor Doris Bergen. Anna's book, Empathy in Contemporary Poetry After Crisis, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020 and received honorable mention in the MSA First Book Award. Congratulations. I don't know if I'm allowed to say congratulations, and it's been a few months, but nevertheless, congratulations for that. Anna has her articles published in Contemporary Literature and the Bristol Board of English Studies. And she has a forthcoming chapter in a peer-reviewed collection called Understanding Visitor Experience at the Holocaust Museum and Memory Sites. In 2016-17, she was a Cumming Foundation Fellow at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And her PhD is from York University, and her supervisor was Professor Sarah Horowitz, who also doesn't need introduction here, our colleague and huge friend of the Center for Jewish Studies here at U of T. Anna is also a poet, and she published a poetry collection called Sue the Butterflies and the chapbook Spirit Clenched. I don't know if we'll hear a little bit of poetry in Anna's talk today, maybe a little bit, but again, she will be our last speaker. So I invite Joanna Krongold to start the panel. Joanna, if you need the PowerPoint and everything, you know what to do. So welcome.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Anna. And I'm so happy to be here with Sara-Jane and Anna to have this conversation. A human doesn't have a heart like mine. The human heart is a line, whereas my own is a circle, and I have the endless ability to be in the right place at the right time. These words from Markus Zusak's 2005 novel, The Book Thief, come from an unusual source, the striking narrator of the text, death. Through this explanation, death introduces the idea that time, like its own heart, does not always operate in strictly linear or chronological ways. The novelist Dara Horn considers a similar idea in her nonfiction collection, People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present. She describes time in the Jewish tradition as, quote, a spiral of a spiral, a tangled telephone cord in which the future was present, which was essentially the past. Similarly, death in The Book Thief can exist in between states of living and dying, inhabiting multiple temporal and physical spaces at once. This liminality, the threshold existence that death occupies as both character and narrator in The Book Thief, constitutes a foray into new representational territory. Children's and young adult Holocaust literature, in the wake of Zusak's exploration of the magical in-between spaces that haunt such narratives, expanded to include magical realism, liminality, and hybrid genres. This presentation that I'm going to be giving you today examines Zusak's important work alongside that of another innovator, Gabriel Savit, and his category-resistant Holocaust novel, Anna and the Swallow Man. Despite the interaction of a number of narrative techniques in these two novels, certain generic classifications provide productive frameworks of analysis. For example, Farah Mendelssohn defines liminal fantasy as one in which magic lurks in shadows and margins, often taking place on the threshold between real and imaginary worlds. Characters may acknowledge magic, but choose not to engage with it in this formulation. However, liminal fantasy can also include the seeping of the magical world into the so-called real world, even against characters' wishes. Closely connected to magical realism, a genre in which fantastic and mundane events are treated with equal importance and validity, liminal fantasy positions magic as an integral part of the real world. These genres raise questions about the possibilities and limits of Holocaust representation in texts for young people. Often a young person's first introduction to the events of the Nazi genocide, youth literature frequently uses strategies of figurative language to narrate the specific story of a single child, adult, cat, or mouse, when facts and figures seem too enormous to comprehend. This does not mean, however, that genres such as liminal fantasy or magical realism are without controversy in the field of youth Holocaust literature. Those who disapprove of figurative representations of the Holocaust contend, as Elie Wiesel does, that the use of metaphor risks the distortion and diminishment of the traumatic event. As a result, silence is often the preferred option, especially when the facts of history are threatened or denied outright. Questions also arise about whether traumatic events and experiences can be communicated to children without inflicting that trauma on them, and whether children can understand the trauma if communication is attempted. Such concerns often overlook the diversity and specificity of youth Holocaust literature in favor of more generalized notions about suitability and fears about inflicting the horrors of the past onto future generations. In opposition to these fears are the didactic desires and anxieties of those who believe that children must be taught the facts about the Holocaust and learn the associated, often simplified, lessons of history, whether tolerance, remembrance, or specific moral judgments. The many contradictions raised by youth Holocaust literature are thus in part owing to its encounter with at least two figurative muzzles, one in the form of the representational difficulties or impossibilities facing all Holocaust literature, and the other in the form of perceived appropriateness and assumed age-based maturity levels. Authors of Holocaust literature for young people struggle with oversimplifying the events of World War II to the point of distortion, or risk terrorizing children with the brutal truths of historical fact. Similarly, such authors must navigate the indefinite ground between artistic freedom and historical accuracy, a feat that is made more difficult because of the particular demands of Holocaust representation. The issue of historical accuracy and authenticity in youth literature becomes highly contentious when the subject is the Holocaust, an event that is viewed by many as the epitome of inexpressible horror, and an event that has been politicized, elevated, and denied in the decades following World War II. Redemptive and generalized narratives clash with those that attempt to represent or gesture at the gruesome, near-fantastic reality of the Holocaust, leading to a wide array of texts, both inventive and informative. As The Book Thief and Anna and the Swallow Man show, referential, comparative, or otherwise figurative dynamics used in youth Holocaust literature often allow the silence of the Holocaust to remain intact, a haunting presence that can never be literally represented. Many traditional authorial techniques are abandoned in favor of those that explore the contradictions inherent in all Holocaust literature. Non-chronological narration, metaphorical experimentation, and linguistic play are all ways in which Zusak and Savit subvert expectations, seemingly aware that their Holocaust stories cannot be contained or expressed using conventional means. They therefore use liminal fantasy and magical realism as generic strategies and stylistic tools that necessarily involve an awareness of literature's representational limits. In doing so, they are also able to figuratively approach Dara Horn's formulation of the Jewish tradition as a melding of the past, present, and future. Liminal fantasy and magical realism, then, are important influences on The Book Thief and Anna and the Swallow Man, although, as will become clear, even these strategies cannot contain the blending of form that Zusak and Savit foreground in their texts. Nonetheless, both authors use aspects of liminal fantasy as tools to convey and intensify traumatic events or experiences that might otherwise be unrepresentable in literature. Zusak uses concepts of liminal fantasy to innovatively narrate specific events during the Holocaust and the Second World War from the perspective of death in The Book Thief. Savit, in sometimes similar and sometimes contrary ways, explores the murky terrain of magical realism, fairy tale, and fable, questioning the limits of language to represent these near-fantastic horrors. Linking their use of fantasy and magic to places and spaces of threshold, both texts propel Holocaust literature for young people into new representational domains. The Book Thief employs magic and fantasy in subtle but effective ways. The novel details the life of Liesel Memminger, a German orphan who is adopted by a middle-aged couple after her younger brother dies and her mother relinquishes custody over Liesel. Attempting to survive Nazi Germany in a small town outside of Munich, Liesel's foster family chooses to shelter a young Jewish man, Max, in their basement. The growing love and trust between Liesel, her foster parents, Max, and Liesel's best friend create the central character-driven thrust of the novel as their wartime hardships intensify. By affording Death the role of narrator in the story, Zusak locates his novel in innovative territory. The reader becomes intimately acquainted with Death's character and storytelling techniques as the novel is driven toward its seemingly inevitable conclusion. In part, this conclusion feels inevitable because Death is the ultimate omniscient narrator, revealing to the reader, if not the characters, who will die and how many times Liesel will be visited by Death. This narrative strategy can be seen as both foreshadowing and backshadowing, a term that the children's literature scholar Adrian Kurtzer borrows from Michael Andre Bernstein, quote, to describe the process by which we judge the behavior of characters set in the past as though they should have known what we know now, end quote. The power of the text's dramatic irony derives from this simultaneous foreshadowing and backshadowing, but also from the circularity of time as understood by Death in the quotation with which I began this presentation. Death's circular heart is a fitting metonymic image for its ability to be present and absent, foreshadowed and backshadowed, always already located in the past and the future. This liminal conceit is augmented by Death's comprehension of the human world via metaphors, particularly metaphors of sense and color. Zusak employs this figurative device in ways that challenge the boundaries of both fantasy and youth Holocaust literature. It is not uncommon to encounter phrases from Death such as, "The day was gray, the color of Europe," or "The eyes were like coffee stains," or perhaps most startlingly, "The sky was the color of Jews." These personifications and synesthetic renderings of color represent one way that Death understands the world based on inversions of what humans would consider orderly, normal, and real. Such inversions are not only metaphorical, however. They are ontological transpositions that reveal the thresholds upon which such Holocaust literature is based. A poignant example of this revelation occurs at the very end of the text, when Death visits Liesel, now an old woman, for the last time. The final words of the text, addressed to both Liesel and the reader, are labeled "A Last Note from Your Narrator," and simply read, "I am haunted by humans." This reversal of the human comprehension of haunting, which usually involves a spectral return from death, implicates the reader in the liminality it expresses. It forces us to question our assumptions about life, death, and the threshold between them, highlighting the transitional nature of human existence. While death may haunt the living in significant ways in Holocaust literature, here Zusak radically inverts such a convention by stating that, now and forever, it is life that haunts death. Through the final inversion expressed by Death, trauma, liminality, and representation are intrinsically linked in the Book Thief. This link connects Zusak's novel to Anna and the Swallow Man, which explores the possibilities and challenges of using metaphor as a vital figurative device in Holocaust literature. Despite differences in location, these two works illuminate facets of the Holocaust that would be difficult to convey without the narrative strategies of liminal fantasy. Savit's 2016 novel tells the story of a young girl, Anna, whose professor father is apprehended at the beginning of the war. Wandering the streets of Krakow alone, Anna encounters the mysterious Swallow Man and begins a journey with him that will lead them through the woods, villages, and roads of Poland and beyond. The Swallow Man's apparent power to communicate in any language, including bird, is matched by his dogged, perhaps magical ability to evade Nazi threat and capture. By the end of the novel, when Anna and the Swallow Man are separated after having made irreversible sacrifices for each other, their safety and survival is uncertain. Perhaps inspired by The Book Thief, Anna and the Swallow Man explores the importance of metaphor and metonymy in situations of extreme danger and transition. Savit's exploration depends in large part on the mutability of language, how it can morph and change depending on who is speaking and who is listening, how it can become a transformative force, and how, as a result, it can alter reality in significant ways. This is exemplified in the Swallow Man's idea of the language of road. Unlike Polish, German, or Russian, in all of which Anna and the Swallow Man are fluent, road can take names, locations, and even identities without giving them back. As the Swallow Man tells Anna, it's very simple to translate something into road, but it's very difficult to translate anything back. Road allows the Swallow Man to charm peasants into sharing food, for instance, by inventing a story about a common hometown, just as it allows Anna to call the Swallow Man father when they both know that their relationship is much more nebulous. Road is also the language in which Anna learns how to understand the opposing military forces that are encroaching on her native country as animals. As the Swallow Man explains to Anna, the soldiers from the west are wolves, and those from the east are bears. Quote, "They disguise themselves as young men because it's easier for them to travel in human places like roads and cities that way. The wolves and the bears, neither of them like human beings at all, and if they can find a reason to hurt you, they will. They're here because they want the world to be full of animals like them." End quote. Obvious parallels to Art Spiegelman's graphic memoir Mouse emerge here as Savit blurs the line between animal and human. It is not unusual in the time after Anna learns this lesson for her to hear people speaking German or Russian and understand it as wolf or bear. The flexibility of this metaphor also allows Anna and the Swallow Man to effectively transform into fellow animals in order to preserve their own security. The Swallow Man goes on to explain, "Of course, there's a way around this. If you can make one of them wonder if you, like him, are not a person, but a disguised wolf or bear, he will likely let you pass by in safety." However, as becomes clear by the end of the novel, even such safety, based on metaphor, has its limits. For example, when Anna is discovered in a compromised position in the woods by a lecherous peddler, she remembers that one of the Swallow Man's rules of the road is transitions are periods of weakness. This presents an obvious problem for the two outcasts who, almost by profession, exist in transitional spaces. The narrator even states that, quote, "If Anna and the Swallow Man could have been called any one thing, in the way that some people are called farmers or cobblers or milkmen, they would have been called crossers over," end quote. Their liminal status grants them access to the magic of the in-between, even as it eventually threatens their survival. These two road speakers, animal speakers, and deeply cherished, though enigmatic companions are separated at the end of the novel. The uncertainty that pervades Anna and the Swallow Man's conclusion lures readers, perhaps unwittingly, into the interstitial spaces of transition and separation, and then leaves them there. Perhaps the opposite of the dramatic irony present in The Book Thief, the liminality of Anna and the Swallow Man is one that relies, to the very end, on the unknown. These two texts, then, utilize tropes of liminal fantasy, magical realism, and mystery, even as they challenge and expand such categories. Both Zusak and Savit situate their texts in the sometimes indecipherable world between imagination and reality, demonstrating that Holocaust literature for young people can encompass a broad and ever-expanding collection of narrative techniques and representational possibilities. We are now poised on the cusp of a new phase of youth Holocaust representation in more ways than one. Direct access to Holocaust survivors is becoming increasingly rare, while the Holocaust continues to be addressed and explored by writers of fantasy. Influenced by and in dialogue with the past and present, what does the future hold for youth Holocaust literature? Although it is impossible to definitively answer this question, it is clear that the representational possibilities of what I term figurative dynamics have the potential to proliferate exponentially, splaying into undiscovered realms of literary experimentation and enlargement. The Book Thief and Anna and the Swallow Man, for example, occupy and explore literary spaces that are often difficult to define, and their porous and polysemous boundaries encourage an inquisitive expansion of the potential of youth Holocaust literature. As the Swallow Man tells his young protege, "Questions, Anna. Questions are far more valuable than answers. If you continue to seek questions, you cannot stray far off the proper road." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Feel free to clap, the audience members too. And also keep thinking of your questions, because I know I already have 78 questions. So, keep them in mind before you type them in the chat, or you can type them in the chat now. And now let me welcome Sara-Jane with her presentation. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Joanna, for your wonderful presentation. So can everyone see the PowerPoint right now? Perfect. Just gonna start. All right. So in 1979, Holocaust child survivor Elisabeth Gilles described for the first time publicly in the daily Le Monde the consequences of losing her parents to the Holocaust. And I quote her, "Losing your parents under those circumstances, it firstly means suffering, like any orphan from a terrible absence. It is then to be completely devoid of roots and identity, since no one is there to tell you where you came from, since you have no graves or memories." End of quote. Elisabeth's statement draws readers close to historical violence. Elisabeth lost her parents, Michel Epstein and the author Irène Nemirovsky, when she was 5 years old. She survived as a hidden child with her sister, Denise Epstein-Doppler, only to be separated from her after the war. Her statement, emphasizing the loss of familial roots and the traumatic violence of amnesia, also begs a concomitant question. How could one describe pain, loss, and fading memories without using an imaginative medium such as literature to uncover and deal with a traumatic past? My presentation focuses on Denise Epstein-Doppler's and Elisabeth Gilles' working through process to determine how they recover a mother that Vichy France had seized from them. Focusing on Denise's work on her mother's posthumous book, Shternshis, and more particularly on Elisabeth's fictionalization of her mother's stories with Le Mirador Mémoire Rêvée, I consider literature as a site of continuity between Irène Nemirovsky and her daughters, and address how this literary bounds serve as a medium through which to extend the limits of the archives and the recovery of their mother's voice, and help reconnect the sister after the war. Next slide, please. So first of all, for those who might not know who Irène Nemirovsky is, she was one of the most prolific and widely read female authors of the 20th century. Published in France by several editors, Nemirovsky's works saw a second wave of appreciation and reception following the Rentrée littéraire of 2004, with the posthumous publication and adaptation of her book Shternshis by her older daughter Denise. Next slide. So, and in 1930, upon reviewing her literary works, Claude Pierret observed that, and I quote him, "Her talent was universal enough, powerful enough, to overturn all obstacles, to wipe out all prejudices of sex, nationality, religion." End of quote. Still, the economic and political crisis in 1930s Europe and France deepened xenophobia and anti-Semitism amongst the population. Although Irène and her husband Michel tried several times to become naturalized French citizens during the 1930s, requested baptisms in 1938, and wrote letters to Maréchal Pétain to express their gratitude to a country that had welcomed them, their attempts to embrace France's national motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, had finally shown the intolerance of the Vichy regime's anti-Jewish measures. In July 1942, Nemirovsky was arrested as a stateless person of Jewish descent. She was brought to Pithiviers, and together with 928 other Jewish deportees, was sent to Auschwitz. Upon her arrival, 2 days later, her forearm was marked, and a month later, on August 19th, she died. Next slide, please, Lauren. Michel Stein was later arrested on October 9th. When he was seized, Michel urged his eldest daughter, Denise, never to leave the suitcase containing her mom's notebook. Michel, convinced that he would join his wife in relief after so many attempts to reconnect with her, was first kept in a prison in Le Creusot until he was transferred to Drancy. On October 6, 1942, Michel was sent to Auschwitz with his sister Sophie and were immediately sent to the gas chamber and killed. The notebook that Michel made Denise promised to never part with was transported in a suitcase and stored by Julie Dumont. Dumont was actually a French woman and a family friend of Irene who helped save Elizabeth and Denise. And the suitcase was stored until her death in 1956. The suitcase contained photos, paper, some clothes, and Irene's book. The following year, Denise and Elizabeth received a suitcase and the manuscript. Shortly after, Denise sent a typed version of Irene's Suite Française, which Michel had transcribed before his deportation, to journalist Catherine Descartes-Valognes, who deemed the book remarkable but, alas, unfinished. The transcribed version had 2 novellas. The other 3 were meant to take place later during and after the war, comprising a total of 1,000 pages and representing the main work of Irene's life. But Irene was arrested shortly after completing the second novel. So hence, in 1957, Denise and Elizabeth were already aware of the existence of the novel Suite Française since they had their father's transcribed versions. Nonetheless, the notebook and the suitcase remained a mystery. The notebook became a potent literary metaphor for the known and unknown past and the traumatic experiences that the daughters had to carry. According to Denise, it took decades before the daughters opened up the manuscript, and I quote her, "We waited for the return of the legitimate owners for many years." End of quote. When she finally admitted that her mother will never come back, Denise opened up the suitcase to find her mom's notebook. However, once opened, both sisters thought it was perhaps a diary. Here again, they preferred to respect her writings. Moreover, after the war, Elizabeth was quickly taken in by family friends who thought that she would be better with them since she was younger. They did not reach the same conclusion for Denise, however. So for Denise, the worst part of the war was the aftermath. It was to wait for their parents and then realize their death, but it was also because she was separated from her sister. "I knew she was cut off from her past," Denise said. "I rarely saw her." Denise and Elizabeth's separation limited, among other things, their chances to talk about their experiences and share their affects. The daughter separation broke 2 lives, according to Denise, from which both sisters took a long time to find each other. Next slide, please. The daughters' working through process coincide with the growing awareness and formation of public memory of Jewish persecution under Vichy around the end of the 70s and 80s. Yet both sisters found different ways to manage their traumas. In the beginning of the 90s, Denise overcame the emotion that had prevented her from reading the notebook. She then realized that it contained the first 2 installments of her mother's Suite Française, with several differences from her father's version. It took Denise 2 years of diligent work to transcribe the words of her mother's notebook, written so small that she had to decipher them with a magnifying glass because her mother had feared that there will be no more paper or ink. Considering herself a transmission belt rather than a writer, Denise's strong impulse as a witness was to commemorate her parents' stories and remember her mother's forgotten literary works. Losing her parents at the age of 12, essential to her was that the authors come back to life. And so the book is a realistic and unflinching piece that offers a pragmatic picture of French societies under the occupation, a photographic report according to Denise. The level of apprehension communicated in the book is enhanced with Nemirovsky's and her husband's correspondence, granting us a window onto their life during this period, their anxieties and reflections. The book's survival and its publication have been celebrated by Denise as a reconstruction of what the Nazis wanted to destroy, but also as a reaffirmation of the importance of fiction as testimony. Suite Française received many awards, such as the Prix Renaudot, which belatedly reinstated Irene amongst the highest stratum of the French literary world. Her writers whose life was destroyed in silence by the Holocaust, and whose works were forgotten after the war. So Denise's process allowed her to articulate and interrupt the uprooting she experienced. Her working through process ended with her archival works for her sister's book, Le Mirador, and her own reflections and memoirs with Survivre et Vivre in 2008, to which she said afterwards, I'm at peace. Next slide. In contrast, Elizabeth, the younger daughter, used fiction to build a bridge to her forgotten past and deceased mother. Elizabeth was only 5 years old when she lost her parents. And although young, Elizabeth did experience the Holocaust and was a survivor. However, due to her young age, she could not recall her experiences nor her memories, which sank more and more into limbo. So if Elizabeth first asserted herself by suppressing her mother's image, she then transferred the loss by remembering her belatedly with Le Mirador, a biography with fictional segments based on Denise's memories, archival documents, and Elizabeth's dreams, memories of her mother. Next slide, please. And so for Denise and Elizabeth, you can read this quote here. I'm not gonna say it, I have other quotes. But for Denise and Elizabeth, literature was crucially important. It was through writing that the sisters finally reconnected, as Denise stressed. We became real sisters by bringing our parents back to life, end of quote. Reflecting upon the relationship, Nicolas Doppler, so Denise's son and Irene's grandson, told me that, I quote him, what was essential for their own history was the writing of Le Mirador. It encouraged them to revisit their past with much more distance, end of quote. Denise, who previously had to silence her younger sister with a scarf during the war, now helped her sister recover her voice and work through her trauma through literature. Denise, who had too many memories, helped her sister inherit some and recover her mother. But Elizabeth long waited to write down her recollections, in part because of her amnesia, but also because she had seen the repercussion on her older sisters of being incapable of creating a wall around her traumas. For an extended period, silence accompanied Elizabeth as she debated between telling as a means to express past trauma or remaining silent because of the failure of language to adequately capture and represent her experience and the Holocaust. The oscillation between these two actions demonstrates the survival's difficult choice, caught between words and silence and between the danger of telling and those of remaining silent. That she finally overcame her silence by telling the forgotten in 1992 underscores that the events experienced during the Holocaust, albeit erased from the subconscious, can still accompany those who can no longer recover their childhood. Next slide, please. So, in her attempt to recover her mother's voice, Elizabeth had to address various questions and confront elements of her own identity that she had partially avoided until then. Russia, her mother's relationship to Judaism, and her mother's death. Elizabeth wanted a documented and realistic biography, but the problem was that she had no documents on her from before 1930 at that time. The archives were utterly silent on Irene's early life when Elizabeth started the research. So she relied on her older sister's memory and knowledge, but Elizabeth's fictional imagination was also fueled by her desire to know a world that her mother had lived in prior to the Holocaust, a process to reclaim an earlier history and life from before the traumatic event. As Denise mentioned, and I quote her, I knew it was a vital need for Elizabeth to go in search of a mother she did not remember, end of quote. By linking together memories, fiction, and facts, Elizabeth allowed herself to confront and fix her amnesia and find comfort in imagining her mother's little known past. Le Mirador reveals Elizabeth's anxieties and affect by writing her mother's stories in the first person. By doing so, Elizabeth acted to articulate her mother's path and create her own recollection. The first person narration can be seen as an initial step for Elizabeth to express her mother's voice, which had been abruptly silenced during the Holocaust. It shows an intimate relationship that had been ruptured and was now relieved from the daughter's perspective. We witness Irene's life, thoughts, and anxieties via the eye, granting us a more intimate perspective on the novelist while permitting us to link Elizabeth's amnesia to reconstructed and dream memories. In her struggle to understand her place in the world and by writing in the first person, Elizabeth also decided to assume the challenge and push boundaries by recovering her own voice. Indeed, chapters of Le Mirador are punctuated by italicized paragraphs that records Elizabeth's own recollection and voices. So hence, the first person narration embodied the figure of the hitherto unknown woman to her mother, while she describes part of her own life using third person narration. The two women's voices then overlap, giving each other the floor and representing this transgression in which the past not only interacts with the present, but interrupts it. But the first-person narration also served as a disconnecting process. In 1992, Elizabeth told Miriam Anisimov in an interview that she first had to confront the problem of her parents' blindness in the course of writing Le Mirador. While recognizing that her mother had taken steps to save them, for instance, in having the family baptized and asking for Dumont's help, Elizabeth was foremost troubled by her mother's obliviousness to the growing danger that Jew faced at the time. Quoting Elizabeth, "She lived in a privileged world without understanding what was happening around her." End of quote. Here, the use of the first-person narration served as a disconnecting process with which Elizabeth was able to distance her thoughts and judgments by having her mother express her own reflection in accordance with later discourse about the Holocaust. Through her Mémoire rêvée, the softening of Irene's views and choices, or by expressing Irene's remorse and condemning her earliest works, which Nemirovsky did to an extent, but not in as elaborate a way as Elizabeth did in her book, Elizabeth allowed for healing. She allowed herself to reconcile the figure of her mother and dissociate her mother's choices by voicing her mother's later judgments and reflections. Elizabeth let herself reconcile the child's resentment and judgment she once felt with her conflicting desire to love and forgive, and the child's utmost desire to see her parents' image as intact. The word mirador refers to her observation tower, or a belvedere. From the Spanish verb mirar, which means to look, the book's title suggests that the readers have une prise de vue, a point of view on Irene and Elizabeth from the perspective of Irene's younger daughter, whose memories of her parents were already forgotten. With Le Mirador and her dream memories, Elizabeth allowed readers and scholars to get a glimpse of Irene's life and her own, and to delve into the two women's reflection, affects, and memories. Yet, Elizabeth's aims of writing her dream memories of her mother took as prerequisites the needs to embrace the silences, the unfinished, the ongoing questioning, and the untold. Hence, Elizabeth's use of fiction and imaginative memories also protected both women from completely unraveling their affects, traumas, and personal memories. The narrative strategy Elizabeth employed induced readers to better comprehend the victim's experiences, so here, Irene, which readers would have perhaps otherwise forgotten, and to hear the survivor, Elizabeth, even when some of these memories could not be perfectly recalled. Next slide. So in 1996, after the publication of Le Mirador, Elizabeth wrote Un paysage de cendre, a novelization of her own experience as a hidden child during the war. The passage from Le Mirador to Un paysage enabled her to finally transfer her voice found in her previous novel and depict her own experiences, again by using fiction. That same year, Elizabeth also published Le Crabe sur la banquette arrière, a novelization of her own battle with cancer that ultimately led to her death that same year. Elizabeth is buried in the Jewish section of the Belleville Cemetery next to her grandparents. Denise followed her in 2013 and is buried between Elizabeth and an inscription that records their parents' death at Auschwitz, having found, however, belatedly, if you remember the quote from the beginning, a cemetery in which to rest. Next slide, and last one. So, studying the history of Irene, Denise, and Elizabeth, and although this is only a small overview of my thesis, offers the readers proximity to the family's experiences, emphasizing the importance of art as a medium for working through trauma while highlighting and carrying on Irene's rich literary heritage. Irene's daughters, through archival research, methodological application, and fiction, allayed Irene's biggest fear that her books would be forgotten and allow us to rediscover the novelist. This process enabled both daughters to work through their affects, absence, and loss, each in their own way, and to reconnect with each other. And so perhaps the process were not only about them, but about the violence and brutality that disrupted their lives. Yet the daughters' efforts also opened up the possibilities of seeing the Holocaust as a site of continuity and reconciliation. Denise's work, Ensuite Française, allowed her to bring back her parents' voice and her mother's oeuvre to the world and to work through her traumas. Her subsequent interviews and her work for Elizabeth's Le Mirador finally enabled her to pursue her working through, as well as reconnect with her sister and share memories. As for Elizabeth, her novels and her reconnection with her sister allowed her to inherit memories and bridge her amnesia with dream memories. So on the one hand, Denise's process filled the gaps and facilitated closure, On the other hand, Elizabeth's process permitted her to bridge the gaps and construct her own recollection while respecting the silences and the imperative of the unknown. The richness of this method elicited in readers and scholars both consciousness and a stronger receptiveness toward adequately dealing with and representing a traumatic past. It seeks to uncover victims' and survivors' agency and voices, as well as to recognize their own process as a legitimate subject of history and scholarly writings. So thank you. I have also my references in the next slide, but that'll be okay.
Thank you so much, Sara-Jane. So much to unpack, and I encourage our audience to start putting their questions in Q&A. We already have a number of really interesting questions to Joanna, so please put your questions to Sara-Jane in the Q&A. And now we're welcoming Anna Veprinska with her presentation. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to Michael Rosenthal for inviting us to speak here today. I'm honored to be speaking to you alongside Sara-Jane and Joanna, and thank you, Anna, for moderating this discussion. I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement, and this applies to where we're speaking from today, the University of Toronto. I'm speaking to you today from the Greater Toronto Area, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'm going to share my screen. You can all see that, right? Okay, perfect. And Anna is right. I will be sharing my poems today, probably mostly just poems. So here goes. So I'd like to begin in the poetic, not the prosaic, though of course to say that is to begin in the prosaic, by opening with a poem I wrote while teaching a literature of the Holocaust course in the summer of 2020. As so many courses did by then, this course took place online, which means this poem is set in my apartment, though it's also set elsewhere, the classroom, memory, and the textual terrain of the works we read. And the poem is titled Lessons During a Pandemic. In their filthy joy, the upstairs neighbors laugh through the vents. Meanwhile, I am virtually teaching Elie Wiesel's Night. Some students have faces, others are little black boxes on the screen. During the question period, when I say, ask anything, one of the students asks, how do we deal with this grief? I should have said anything but that. I stumble through an answer. I think it's okay to be sad. It's okay to align yourself with sorrow. Then I turn the question, this mouth weapon, back at them. How do others deal with this grief? Some students speak of sharing their thoughts with loved ones, others of writing or drawing. What helps me, I finally say, is being able to hold the book and let it go simultaneously. Never mind, I don't do this very well. As we say our goodbyes, the box is dwindling. I add, maybe stupidly, when you rejoin the world, don't forget about the laughter. The question at the center of this poem is the one my students ask me. How do we deal with this grief? This question is also at the center of my choice to respond to my engagement with the Holocaust through poetry. Let me explain that further. The closing image, and I'm sure you recall it, of Elie Wiesel's Night is Wiesel, post-liberation, seeing his reflection for the first time since the ghetto. Staring back at Wiesel in the mirror is, in Wiesel's words, a corpse. Another image or moment. In Charlotte Delbau's memoir, Auschwitz and After, Delbau recounts peeling off her stockings for the first time after months in Auschwitz and discovering that her toenails have detached from her body and attached to the stockings. It's not history, or let's say not only history, that holds these moments, that commemorates them, but art, memoir, image, song, poem. These moments or images or thoughts, among many others, have haunted me long after reading the texts. And there have been other moments of haunting too. Let me interrupt this reflection with a poem I wrote that shoulders one of these moments. In 2017, I had the great honor of working with Helen Berkowitz, a Holocaust survivor based here in Toronto who was looking for someone to write her memoir for the Israeli Foundation Sustaining Memories project. The short poem I'll read is about the term survivor, which of course, similar to terms like testimony and victim and witness, has its own complicated set of openings and problematics. And on the left is a picture of Helen. This is from the Israeli Foundation, and the poem is titled Survivor. She was introduced to me as a survivor, but throughout our acquaintance and later our friendship, I wondered at all inside her that didn't survive. The past selves checked at the door marked continue living. More moments in another poem. There is a family story about my grandmother's brother, my granduncle, that has been on my mind for about a decade now. And a few months ago, I finally wrote a poem about it. The poem is called Tale from a Train Station. In 1941, my grandmother's family was fated to live. With her parents and brother, grandmother, a girl then, was fleeing east from the Nazi advance into Ukraine. Tickets in hand, grandmother and her parents paced the train station where grandmother's brother had failed to arrive. Delayed perhaps by a bike ride or a book's climax, losing, as the cliche accuses, track of time, that the repercussions of this loss are seldom tended. I imagine, but whom does imagination serve? The horrified heartbeats of his parents, their weeping and reckoning while clutching their young daughter's arms. When the train came, they boarded it. For the remainder of the war, my granduncle, a boy of maybe 10, hid at a friend's house, breathed through perilous, parentless years, awaited a family reunion. What thoughts occupy the mind of an abandoned child? What thoughts torment the minds of his parents? After the war, they reunited, each alive by miracle, each carrying this familial history like a hard lump near the heart for generations. To return to my contemplation of these haunting moments, what could I do, as the students in my Holocaust literature class asked so earnestly, to deal with this grief? There was something about the neatness of an academic paper, the genre the institution calls for, that could not account for the complex landscapes of trauma and effect. And I'm hopeless as a painter. So I did what I could do. I wrote poems. Poetry, which allows for non-linearity, for moving between time and form and identity, was what could hold both my emotions and my various encounters with the Holocaust. As a student, a reader, a teacher, a visitor to Holocaust memory sites, a writing partner to a Holocaust survivor, a third-generation descendant of family members who were both victims and survivors of the Holocaust, and a listener and researcher of Holocaust testimonies. About this last identity, that is, a listener and researcher of Holocaust testimonies. In my research at the University of Toronto, I have the honor of working with the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. This archive, as again you probably already know, consists of video interviews with survivors and witnesses of the Holocaust and other genocides. My project consists of locating the interviews in which survivors read their poems, considering these poems in their literary and socio-historical context, and then responding to them by writing my own poems. In composing my own historically informed poetry, I am particularly concerned with the possibility of empathy and trespass, and the ways these can be indistinguishable. If we understand empathy as the imaginative process of stepping into another or feeling into the other, as the German Anfühlung, from which the English empathy is translated, suggests, then what happens if we overstep into the other? In other words, are my poems an empathetic attempt to approach the histories of others and/or intrusions into or appropriations of those histories? I will return to these questions again after I share with you two of the poems from this project. One mine, the other written by the Holocaust survivor and poet Jacob Rosenberg. There's a photograph of Rosenberg here. Rosenberg reads this poem during his 1996 interview with the Visual History Archive in Melbourne, Australia. Born in 1922 in Lodz, Poland, to a Jewish family, Rosenberg, along with his parents and two older sisters, was imprisoned in the Lodz ghetto in 1940. In August 1944, Rosenberg and his family were transported to Auschwitz, where his entire family perished. He was liberated from Ebensee on May 8, 1945, and was the only surviving member of his family. He reads a handful of his poems during his interview, and I'd like to play a clip of him reading one of these poems. It's a short poem titled No Exit, where he articulates the struggle with language in attempting to describe the Holocaust. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to stop share and share the other screen. Can you all see that? Okay. And hopefully you'll all be able to hear that. No, you won't. Hold on a second. Okay. Maybe if Joanna and Sara-Jane could give me a thumbs up when I started to make sure you can hear it.
In the poem I call No Exit. How do you describe it? What alphabet do you employ? What words? What language? What silence? What scream? I consulted all the linguists, all the poets, all the wise men, men of knowledge, and then God himself. He dropped his head in silence, and with a sigh, he pointed to his darkest labyrinth, his blackest labyrinth. He did not dare to enter. It had no exit.
If we can return.
Okay. The poem I wrote in response to Rosenberg's poem and testimony touches on some of Rosenberg's history, but it does so through the eyes of a secondary witness, me, encountering a mediated video interview that recounts Rosenberg's firsthand Holocaust experiences. My poem also encounters and repositions Rosenberg's history in the context of my own experiences. Read with an acknowledgement of these layers of mediation and repositioning, I'll share my poem with you now. And the poem is called Labyrinth. Labyrinth, for and after Jacob Rosenberg. In the poem, the Holocaust survivor invokes a labyrinth as he attempts to surface a language with which to compass his past. To say unspeakable is to dismiss, to door, to declare, you, word-bred, history-coddled soul, can't enter here. No, even Ariadne's thread disintegrates in this labyrinth, where a sister hangs herself on barbed wire after learning her child was gassed. How to depart that world for this one with its frivolity and other griefs. I don't know, the survivor concedes and raises his hands with a shrug. Years ago, on a genocide education program, while weaving through the barracks in Auschwitz, my right arm went numb, veered away from sensation in a way I experienced neither before nor since. Sometimes our bodies articulate what our language cannot. But my Auschwitz, swarming with exhibits and restless tourists, is not his Auschwitz. My language, not his language. I am not talking about Polish or English, rather about shadow, about loose bits of frayed thread. Before I close, I'd like to return to the issue of appropriation, which must be mentioned because poetry, like any other artistic representation, is not immune to it. In the piece I just read, in response to Rosenberg's testimony, for example, I'm aware and uncomfortable that creating a poem about the experiences, language, and suffering of another is both witnessing and transgression. Attesting to this in her work, Other People's Stories, Amy Schumann posits that appropriation can use one person's tragedy to serve as another's inspiration. And so I offer these poems as problematic works that have been kindled by the suffering of others and by my own hauntedness in response to that suffering. With what light tread might we walk into another's life without imposing on that life? In ending this reading, I'll close as I opened with a poem. This final poem considers another genocide, the genocide against Indigenous peoples in Canada, and the news this past summer of remains being found at sites of former residential schools. The poem places this news and this genocide in conversation with the Holocaust, with commemoration, and with the ever-weedy concept of empathy. And if it's all right, I'll read the text as an oral piece without including it in the PowerPoint. And instead, I have several photographs here, and you may recognize two of these. The poem is titled Shoes. Remains of 215 Indigenous children are found at the site of a former residential school in Kamloops. Remains, a two-syllable euphemism for bones, for corpses, for genocide. How much of this country is an unmarked grave? Land carries on reckoning with its history while we scramble to rewrite ours. From Victoria to Halifax, makeshift memorials of children's shoes materialize. How much of this country is an unmarked grave? I recall gawking at the piles of shoes at the exhibit at Auschwitz, contemplating how clothing could cart absence, absence cart commemoration. There is a traveling empathy museum currently in Cologne, offering visitors the chance, while listening to another's story, to literally walk a mile in their shoes. What comes from the reification of metaphor? How much of this country is an unmarked grave? At a conference on empathy in Basel in 2017, a pair of worn red running shoes takes center stage. Feel free to wear these and leave your own shoes in their place, the conference organizers explain, creating an invitation, not merely a gathering. Every day of the conference, I watch to see if the shoes have been replaced. Every day, the same red shoes remain untouched on stage. Nobody takes up the organizer's offer. Nobody, is it because you wish to avoid discomfort? Nobody, is it because you won't risk losing your own shoes? Nobody, is it because this is a game and we are all serious academics suspicious of playfulness? No, these are not it, but you know why. You too would not clothe yourself in shoes reeking of rubbered absence, Empathy, the lie with whom we sit making small talk until decorum dictates we can depart. 215 indigenous children, 215 remains, makeshift memorials of children's shoes, coast to coast. How much of this country is an unmarked grave? Thank you so much for listening.